Okay, welcome. I think we might try to get underway. This is Forum 3B, Demographic Disruption, Why We Need to Save More and Invest Differently. So if you thought you were in 3A, you'd best exit. But I'm sure you're all very keen to be here. My name's Cate Wood, and I'm Chair of CareSuper and National Chair of Women in Super, and I'm chairing this panel. And with me, I have Raf Choudhury on my left, Senior Investment Strategist, Investment Solutions Group of State Street Global Advisors. And on my right is Brnic van Wyk, who is the Head of Asset/Liability Management at QSuper. You can access their bios in the conference app. In terms of today's session, we're going to have a presentation from Raf initially with some interesting demographic research results. And then he will join us back at this table and we'll have a bit of a conversation about it. But we actually invite you to participate by questions. If you want to raise your hand, there are microphones around. Or you can go to the conference app. Make sure you type in Forum B in terms of asking a question, and it will come up here on the iPad, so we'll keep an eye on that. If you like someone else's question, if you have that open on your phone, like their question, because that'll put it up the list. The more likes, the higher it goes, and gives us an indication, obviously, of the level of interest of the audience in that question. So feel free, you can put through questions, you can put through opinions, whatever. We'll see where we can take that. We're going to ask a polling question before we start. So if we can get that up. I'm too short to see anything here. Okay. So the question is, do you think changing demographics will have an impact on the ability of your superannuation fund to deliver on future investment returns? So if you go to Forum B under the app, polls and live Q&A, that's where you can answer that question. So we'll just wait a little bit and see, are you all doing that? I think the whole question of the changing demographics of our membership is going to be a challenge for us in the future, and certainly the question of investment returns in the current environment and how we can deliver to our members. So it should be an interesting session. And I heard I don't know if you're at the forum before, where ME Bank had some very interesting delineations of members in terms of post-retirement, from the go-go, which was 65 to 75, to the no-goes from 75 to the 85s, and then the oh-no's, I think it was, post that. So maybe that you can factor that in to the analysis. So have we got our results as yet? Oh, well, I think that's fairly conclusive, that we have 70% saying that they will have to take into account demographic changes in the future. Okay, well, I think we will hand over to Raf now. The app is, the AXA Investment Managers Live Q&A is now open, so at any time you can type in your question, so don't wait for the end, and I'll hand over to Raf to present. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I finally made it, even with a almost broken back, but shows signs of getting old. There we go. Excuse a bit of a preamble before I kind of get into the presentation, but I kind of wanted to start with a bit of an introduction around how we think about demographics in general. So generally when we speak about demographics, we're thinking about people getting older, age-related, changes in population, but generally it tends to be age-based. We like to think about it slightly more broadly, or actually slightly more broader than that. We actually think it encompasses also the changes in consumer and worker characteristics. And so there's a slight distinction there. And you'll see how, as we progress how that actually factors into how we think about demographics. But the age-based notion of demographics is one that is embedded in the industry from a traditional perspective. And it's really based around 3 stages of life. So you're born, you go to school, you start work, and then you retire. We actually think the shifts in demographics that we're seeing are actually changing that. We actually think that the old 3-phase model of life is actually evolving now. And actually, Cate mentioned earlier, the no, go, yeah. Can't quite remember what it was, but that's broadly in line with what we're thinking. We've actually termed it slightly differently. We think there's a 4th phase, and we call it the between ages, which I'm not quite sure I'm a big fan of that, but that is what we call it. And before we really kind of get into it, the between age phase has come about because of the fact that we are living longer. So before we kind of get into this, I kind of wanted to kind of explore that a little bit as well. It's pretty well documented that populations are growing, we are living longer. And there's been a study called the Blue Zones, and that's kind of looked at this and kind of tried to explore this. So you're probably asking, what are the Blue Zones? Well, the National Geographic did a study, and they identified 5 zones around the world, so 5 different places in the world, where the average life expectancy exceeds 100. Now, these are very specific places around the world. One's in the US, one's in Greece, one's in Italy, one's in Costa Rica, and the final one is in Japan. But they're very specific in the sense that they're towns or areas where life expectancy exceeds 100, but you go over one town and you're not seeing the same characteristics. So what they looked to do was to try and figure out why these 5 places are showing higher levels of life expectancy, which is, I think we'd all like to know, because it would help us all live a bit longer. And actually, I am in a very privileged position to be able to share with you, some might term it the elixir of life, the Holy Grail. But the 5 common threads that they came across that they identified across these 5 different zones that they kind of think help explain why people live longer in these zones. So the first one was walking, and this is exercise-based, but not just going to the gym or pumping iron or running, more kind of exercise-based, incorporating it into your lifestyle. The second was diet. They found that on average in these zones, they predominantly had a vegetarian-based diet. They ate meat about once a week. The third one, which I think most of you will probably be quite happy with, it was wine. They found that people who drink wine tend to live longer. They found that people in these regions drank red wine. Now they do say moderation, so I am going to conduct a personal study to figure out exactly what moderation is, and I'll share those results when I have them. The fourth was purpose, kind of having a purpose to get up, a purpose to live, getting up, going to work or whatever. And the final one was family or society, or having a community around you. So now that I've shared the elixir of life, I'd recommend you all to adopt at least one of these. And I think we have a poll where I'm pretty sure I know what the answer will be, but it'll be interesting to see which of the 5 you would pick. I'm pretty sure I know which one it will be. Walking, it's going to be walking. The Australians are so healthy, So this is great, and I think we'll come back to the poll at the end of the session. So this is great. So I hope this kind of set the scene. We are all living longer. There are reasons for it. We've seen evidence of this, and it's great. Who wouldn't want to live longer? But at the same time, it does cause a problem. And what we're calling it is a demographic time bomb. Now, in itself, living longer isn't such an issue, but there are a couple of things that kind of combine to create an issue for us, and especially for us as an industry. The The first is that the population as a whole is aging, so the average age is increasing. There's kind of predominantly two factors for this. One is lower fertility rates, and second is migration. And ultimately what this means is that we're having a lack of the youth in our societies being replenished. There's a lack of replenishment of that youth. The average age and cohort of our society is increasing in age. The second problem is that, well, not so much a problem, but the second identified issue is that we're all living longer. Now, on average, every decade increases life expectancy by about 1 year. And there are so a couple of facts for you here. The number of people over 100 years old, sorry, my English is appalling, and I'm from the UK. The number of people that are over 100 has quadrupled since over the last 30 years. That's expected to quadruple again by 2035. That's kind of staggering when you think about it. The number of people over 100 that will be alive in the next decade or two. And to really kind of exemplify this issue, as you know, I'm from the UK. I'm sure you guessed from my accent. In the UK, when you turn 100, the Queen sends you out a telegram. 50 years ago, she used to write out a little telegram, put it in an envelope, send it off to you. The number of people that live to 100 now has become not an issue, but has become so large, sorry, that she actually employs a team of 7 people to write and manage the telegrams for her. It's astonishing, a whole team of 7 people to send out telegrams for people that turn 100 every year. So we can see, kind of, these two things combined create an issue for us as a society and as an industry here. But the real time bomb component of this comes from the fact that, combine this with the fact that we have lower expected returns, which actually results in people living longer. We all still want to have a certain lifestyle when we retire. We know returns are going to be lower, so it creates a burden or an increased responsibility for people to save. Oops, sorry. Technical issue. Now, when I talk about the fact that we think about demographics being changes in characteristics and not just age, one of the things that we looked at was, well, people have always got old. How was it dealt with before? Well, the UN create this old age dependency ratio. And what it basically shows is the proportion of the population over 65 compared to the working age population, which is assumed to be 15 to 64. And historically, it would have measured a burden on the society. You know, a proportion of how much are the young people having to take care of the old. And as you can see, this has been on the increase since 1985. And it's not just a local issue, it's a global issue that's taking place across developed and less developed countries. But the one thing that's really changed over the last 10, 15, 20 years is that while this ratio shows that there's a burden placed on the young, that burden actually is being carried by the elder people now. So the fact that our population is getting older has resulted in them actually looking after themselves. Because of the fact that we have an average age increasing, we have lower fertility rates, there's less burden on young people to take care of the old, which in some cultures, historically, that would have been the case. But what we're seeing is that there's actually been a significant change in this. So typically, the ratio assumes that you retire at 65, but when you actually look at it, 8.5% of the population in 2015 of the working force population were above 65. That's expected to double by 2050. So a good example of this is actually my dad. He's 70 this year. Should have retired about 5 years ago. Lives in the UK. I go home about once a year, and I was talking to him at Christmas about this. And my dad's self-employed, he's an accountant, has his own accountancy firm. And I asked him, I said, oh, well, Dad, you're 70, why don't you retire? Put your feet up, cash out, take it easy. Now, Dad's a bit of a joker, and he turned around and went, well, how else am I going to get away from your mum? So, which I knew he was joking because they're both accountants and they both work at the same firm, so there was no hope of him getting away, so. But my mum was there, and I was like, my mum's a little bit more serious than my dad. And she turned around and went, well, what else are we going to do? You know, your sister's married and got kids, your brother's married and got kids, you've flown the coop and headed off to Australia. You know, will we sat around all day doing, you know, twiddling our thumbs? So for them, it's about giving themselves purpose, kind of keeping busy, keeping active, keeping their minds going. She also said, you know, for them it's less about an income, but she did say, well, at least it helps pay for the flights for them to come over and visit me once a year. I try and put it off Cummings, but it doesn't really work that well. But for them, it's a choice. But when we've actually done a poll of people still working over 65, and for my parents, it is a choice. It's a lifestyle choice. They decided that they want to continue working. They don't need to. But about 50% of respondents actually responded that they have to keep working. And the reason they have to keep working is because there's a burden on them. There's an increased responsibility for them to save for retirement. There's a lack of income, a lack of capital that they have. And the responsibility is really on them now, for them to save, especially since we've seen the industry move from DB to DC. And that's really propagated this issue of the burden of responsibility to save. Now, it's an interesting one because we've shifted the burden from DB to DC, and we're telling people to manage their own finances. But when we look at the financial literacy rates, you can see how low they are. And you know, this isn't just emerging markets where they're low or less developed countries. Australia is right up there, the UK is up there, the US is up there. So we're asking people to make decisions about how to save for their retirement when they're not really, when they don't have the financial literacy to be able to make those decisions. And what it does is it actually puts back a responsibility on us as an industry, but not in the sense of a responsibility to make them save, but more in the sense of a fiduciary duty to make sure that we're designing products and managing assets appropriately for them. And the key here really is that globally about 80% of people end up in a default fund. So you get sent your questionnaire, whether it's risk-based or whatever, and you get asked which fund you want to go into, and most people just pick the default because it is the default. And so that puts a stronger fiduciary duty on us as an investment community to do a better job of managing those defaults and those funds in general. So. Now, one of the things that we need to take account of is that returns are lower. Going forward, we're not going to see the returns that we've seen over the last few years. This chart here kind of compares returns over the last 30 years across assets and compares future returns under two different scenarios. So one's a growth recovery scenario and one's a slow growth scenario. Now, we've just had a 9-year bull run in equity, so I'm guessing, but there's no guarantees, that we're looking at the blue chart, not the orange chart, in terms of the returns that we can expect. So that kind of puts a real kind of pressure on us as an industry in terms of trying to make sure that we design products that are appropriate. And one of the things that we need to think about is that when someone retires, and this is what we need to think about when we design these products, when someone retires, they've got two problems that they need to solve for. If I gave you $100,000 and said, there you go, you're 65, happy days, cash lump sum, Now go and make it last until the day you die. You end up with two outcomes. People either overspend, because they go, I've just been given $100,000, and I don't think I'm going to live that long, so might as well just go blow it. Or people underspend because they get too cautious. And there is a difference between the response you get from males and females, and I'll let you guess which ones are which. I don't think it'll take too much guessing, but there is a difference there. But ultimately, either way is a fail, because the optimal solution is that you spend that $100,000 in such a way that on the day that you die, you spend your last dollar. And that's what we need to, that's the ultimate goal, and that we need to work towards. So there's a whole range of issues that we're faced with that are coming about from shifts in demographics. And demographics being not just people getting older, but the way that they spend in old age, the way that they behave, the way they consume. And we need to think about ways that we can design solutions to address those. Some of the things that we can do is shifting towards more member-based, member-focused solutions, more bespoke type solutions. That can help address the needs of different types of people that are growing older. For those that are living longer, generating some kind of income product. Typically when you ask someone who's about to retire what they want from their retirement, I showed before, most people are in a DC scheme now, but what most people describe, what they want from retirement, is the end result from a DB scheme. Guaranteed kind of source of income. How do we do that in a lower expected return, in a world where we're expecting lower returns? Well, you're going to have to save more. You're going to have to make your money work harder. And that leads to the increased responsibility to save. And that actually also comes from the financial literacy perspective. We need to make sure that our members understand that they have to save more. I think that's me done. So,
well,
I'll hand back to Cate.
maybe if we get the results of the poll. There they go. So, what a noble lot. We've got purpose for 43%. That's good. And wine. I like diet, actually, 2%. Hilarious.
I wonder if the purpose was to drink more wine.
Yeah, people have been witty and clever in their responses. Thank you, Raph. Just before I hand over to invite Brnic to make some observations from his professional experience and also obviously his experiences at QSuper, on top of that his wider working life. I was just going to ask someone to put me back onto the questions part of this iPad, so I hope that's where it's heading, but I'll hand over to Brnic at the moment.
Thank you, Cate, and thank you, Raph. Good afternoon, everyone. What I'll do briefly is give you an explanation of how QSuper uses demographics and how we take demographics into account when we set investment strategies. This is a process that we started in 2010. We weren't going to waste a good crisis, so this was shortly after the GFC. And we had a session with our trustees in the boardroom where we explained to them that a couple of years before that, we knew that we had members with enough money saved for retirement, and we did nothing. We knew some members were adequately funded, and we did nothing. We also played to them some of the calls from our call center shortly after the GFC. And our CEO at the time said to the board, "Can you hear the fear and the uncertainty in the voice of our member calling?" And the board could acknowledge that, yes. And then it was asked, what can't you hear? And the thing you couldn't hear was us giving them an answer. So it was a pretty stark situation for the board. We also showed them Section 52 of the Act, which places a fiduciary duty on the board to act on behalf of those members who do not select their own investment strategies. Now, this was the start. Okay? So that created the team that I currently involved with, and we had a pretty open brief which said, if you can do anything, what would you do? Because there's actually nothing in the Act that prescribes how you should invest for your default members. So where we started was with what we did know about our members. There's a lot of stuff we actually do know. We actually asked our board whether they knew what the average balance of our members were, and nobody knew. Now, today, I would suggest most boards know the average balance of their members, right? And maybe that has come through APRA reporting and perhaps just a little bit more awareness, retention and attraction. But that is now at least a factor that people are considering. However, I would still argue that a one-size-fits-all default when you know things about your members is pretty indefensible. We know how old they are, we know how much they contribute, we know how much they have in their accounts, we know who are the males, we know who are the females. And these are facts. And using a lot of things we don't know as a defense to do nothing wasn't the approach that our board took. So the answer that we came up with is it depends. Sorry, Siri.
Siri's here. sorry about that.
That's my accent. I can't talk to the phone, sorry. So what we did was we figured out that we didn't know, effectively. So what risks impact on members? Well, it depends. It depends which members you're talking about. It depends what the market environment is. It depends when they want to retire. It depends on everything. So we built a little bit of a dynamic default product. We call that QSuper Lifetime, where as a start, we're breaking down our default members into age and account balance. And that is, to a first order, assists us in identifying people closer to retirement, further away from retirement. Those with a potentially large age pension dependency, in other words, low superannuation balances, and those with high superannuation balances. We observe the behaviours of our members over time. We can see people are starting to retire later. We also see that retirement is not as binary as we pretend it is. It is hard to determine when people retire. I'll give you a silly example. We have a data scientist working in the investment team because we look at our member data. And I asked them a simple question is, at what age do our members retire? And it's 2 years later and we still don't know. And the reason is, if you define retirement by when contributions cease, the answer is 62. If you define retirement by the age at which people open income accounts, the data shows 64. So technically our members disappear off the planet for 2 years. There's some anecdotal reasons for that we've explored with our financial planners, and I'm not going to go into that detail unless you want some entertaining stories. But what this structure has allowed us to do is observe changes. So when we launched it in 2013, the 60-year-olds then only had a certain amount of time in the system, and the economic environment looked different. The 60-year-olds today have been in the system 5 years longer, and the market environment today looks different. So our strategies are different. Okay? We do not have the same strategy as we had in 2007. We do not have the same strategy as we have in 2010. We have a different strategy now, applicable to what the members look like now and to what the market is like at the moment. So the challenge that we put to us and what our board accepted was just to start somewhere. Right? Our stuff is very basic. And if you want some more entertaining stories, I can tell you all the problems that we have with it. But at least we've started, right? The genie is out the bottle. Our board cannot stop making decisions. They cannot stop acting anymore. They can't go back. So they have put us on a continuous path of improvement. As the way in which you can do things, as systems get better, as IT gets better, as our information, our engagement activities get better, we can get better at setting investment strategies. And this is probably well summarized by Lionel Martellini. He works at the EDEC Risk Institute in Europe, where he recently wrote quite a significant paper where he contrasts the difference between what he calls mass production and mass customization. And he says in the investment industry, mass production has taken place. The institutional investment environment is now able to package any investment solution in something that retail investors can access. Call it smart beta, call it factor-based investing, call it volatility management, whatever tactic you want to apply from an investment perspective can now be accessed by retail investors. The problem is not the production. The problem is the mass customization. How do you create investment solutions for people? How do you create outcomes for people? And in his paper, he also quotes Professor Robert Merton by saying, it is not an innovation problem, it's just a tough engineering problem. And at QSuper, we've started tackling that. Thank you.
Thank you. Very interesting insight into QSuper's approach with that. We've got a couple of questions, but before we move on to those, and also if anyone has one in the audience, feel free to wave. I'll rely on my partners up here to also be on the lookout, but I can't let Raf get away with the $100,000, spend it or not spend it, male or female. You've got to tell me who's spending and who's saving.
It won't be surprising. Typically, and this is a broad generalization, men will spend it. And women tend to be a bit more conservative and the main difference here is actually around the belief of, do you think you will live longer? Most men kind of assume, or not assume, but most men will kind of believe that they'll live till 60, 70, 80, 85.
So it's more a how long will I live?
Yeah,
as
and
opposed to
men tend to underestimate it,
yeah.
even though they do have a slightly lower life expectancy, but they still underestimate how long they will live. And so they tend to the response to that question from males tends to be more aggressive in the spending.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of QSuper, that gender question, which is both a behavioural but also related to longevity, is that built into your approach to looking at your members in terms of the lifestyle investment options?
At the moment, gender is implicitly allowed for. So,
how do you implicitly allow for gender?
We have a female-dominant membership. So I would argue we invest for females, really, because we use averages in our membership. But it's actually not that... We were surprised with a lot of the information we saw. Statistically, yes, females live longer. Factually, what we observe is their salaries are lower. Females spend more time out of the workforce, so they have lower balances. But when we got to retirement, females and males retire at the same age, which was a surprise. Actually, we were always taught females are 4 years younger than their male counterparts, which wasn't in our data. So it is not as straightforward that you might think. Some things differ and some things don't.
Thanks.
Going forward, to answer your question, we would like to make an explicit distinction. At the moment, we separate only by 2 factors, although we use everything we know to set strategies. gender and contribution rate are probably the next two most powerful factors we can use to distinguish different contribution rates, different outcomes for members. Yeah.
So you have cohorts based on age and account balance, some combination of those things. Okay. I've got a few questions here that I might flick to. One which is highly supported, asked by Naomi Edwards, which is how did QSuper persuade the board to focus on the data that they had and not the risks from the data that they didn't have?
Well, persuade is a strong word. It is a big part of it hinged off the duty to act, right? So the Superannuation Act places that fiduciary duty on the board. Now, in any situation where you are asked to act, to make a decision, you wouldn't do it blindly. And you would ask, well, what do I know? What can I use to make this decision? And when you talk about creating outcomes for your members, it's natural to ask the first question, well, what do they look like? And it's interesting that we've never asked that until then.
Mm. Do you do back testing? Like, look at, if you hadn't introduced those, what people in the cohorts that you've chosen would get, say, if they were in a balanced fund?
Yes, we have. We've very recently engaged our board and our investment committee on that basis. And the answer was it would have been better if we put them in international equities. It's as simple as that. In hindsight, you know, the insurance didn't pay off. That's almost, let's say, it's like asking, in hindsight, was it used, should you have had your home insurance? Your house didn't burn down. It was a silly decision having the insurance. So hindsight's a perfect science. The decisions we make from an investment perspective is from the philosophy and the principles that we don't know what is going to happen. So we have a philosophy of not taking significant bets, but rather one of diversification.
Thanks. I might direct this one to you, Raph. Oh, we've got one from the floor, have we? Okay, go ahead.
Graham Russell from Media Super. I just wanted to follow up that question you just asked, Cate. Am I reverberating a bit?
Sounds very sort of godlike up here.
And I'm not sure I fully understand the QSuper approach, although I've read about it from time to time. So, but that question you just asked has got me thinking, are we actually just jumping from the frying pan into the fire to some extent, because you're still making decisions for members on not on total information that you've got about them, because you've got no information about what they've got outside super, for example. And if we do take the approach that super is a long-term investment and people are living longer, and the evidence of that is, so going back to, I'll get to the point in a minute, going back to, you know, I took some of the calls after the GFC from members. I understand the fear, the uncertainty, the tears, the crying. But I did have an answer, which is we invest for the long term, and yes, this is a major market correction, but history shows, etc., you know where I'm heading with that. And it was only those members who pulled out and went to cash who really suffered, because if you were still in our balanced option in March 2009, you'd be sitting there looking pretty good today. Now, and I get that if you went into international equities, you'd be looking even better, but I guess what's worrying me is, are we just making it as a different decision for people based on limited information, and shouldn't we have just left them there and instead focus our attention on getting them engaged so they make a decision based on all of their assets and income?
Yeah, I'm happy to comment on that. The statement about long-term, you're absolutely correct. Long-term, rolling, time-weighted returns are always positive. There's a risk premium, and it's rewarded to take risk. But there are members who retired in 2008. they didn't experience that long term. They experienced the retirement when it wasn't good. There are members who retired in 2007 that had 40% more, purely as a result of the time. So to use the two criteria we use at the moment, as a simple example, we only use age and account balance. Now, age, if you're closer to retirement, you face different risks than you would when you're far away from retirement. You face the risk of converting your capital to income, so you face interest rate risk. You face sequence risk, and it was the previous session with Aaron Mini was talking about that. So there are different risks that are being faced for people close to retirement than further away. The reason we use the account balance is because the majority of our members are in the sweet spot of age pension entitlements. We have significant, more than 20,000 financial planning interviews over the years. So we have a good idea what kind of assets they have outside of super. Our members are teachers and nurses, public servants. They're pretty average Australians. And for those with very little money in super, they will see a significant benefit from the government through the age pension. So for them, their balance of risks relative to only one component of the retirement income is quite different to somebody with, say, $500,000, like some of our DB members who are retiring with $5,700,000. They're much more self-sufficient and much less guarantee coming out of benefits from government, which means the kind of risks they can take with their financial assets, which we have in our fund, are significantly different than somebody with less money. It is a first order attempt. As I said, I acknowledge the comments you make, and that is a big debate we have. But this remains the default product, right? So we invest as if they're disengaged, but we communicate as if members are engaged. We have financial planners, we have other options, we have all the ability for people to make decisions that suit their personal circumstances. And we acknowledge the limitations of averages. So in a way, the one guarantee that I can give you as an actuary is the number that I've calculated is wrong. The answer is always going to either be more or it's going to be less. But I know the answer is wrong.
Thanks. I've got one question that's well supported that I might ask Raf to respond to, and that
Sure.
Unfortunately will probably be our last question, which is working longer seems to be the obvious answer. However, that will then drain the job opportunities for the younger generation. Are we just pushing the issue around?
It's an interesting perspective on it, actually. It's a potential risk. I don't think it's what we're seeing, though. I think what we're actually seeing is people living longer, and when we talk about them working for longer, they're not necessarily working full time. A lot of them, at the age of 50, maybe 40, 50, are looking to retrain into a second job or into and it's a different style of working life. Where yes, it may impede the ability of the younger cohorts to work, but they're looking more for full-time employment. And what we're seeing is that actually people are retraining and later in life. My dad's an exception, he still works full-time, but most of them are looking to do something slightly different with their life. They know they're living longer and they want to get more utility out of it. So they may work part-time or do some charity work, travel a bit more, but they know that they need some kind of additional income. They're still getting state pensions and income to draw on, but whether one's replacing the other and pushing the issue out, time will tell.
I guess we can all perhaps maybe be a bit encouraged by, was it Will Sparks's comments last night, where 2 years ago I heard him speak, and the question of the demographics of countries was that India was going to be charging forward because their pyramid looks like this with all these young people, but that now, if you're China looking like that with technology and robots and these sorts of changes, that somehow what sort of demographic arrangements you have will respond differently. So maybe the young can have different working days and different working weeks, and we'll have a universal living wage, and we'll all be happy. Maybe that'll be the outcome.
And to your point there, I mean, the job market segments will look very different in the future. And that's kind of part of the reason why we're seeing people retrain now to be able to move into, to go find a job at Google or Apple, or it's the, you know, when I joined the industry back in more early 90s, everyone I know wanted to get into finance. I don't speak to anyone these days that in university that are actively looking for jobs in finance. It's all media, consultancy, Google, Apple, tech companies. So the nature of the job force is changing as well. So.
Okay, well, we've come to the end of our time. We did have another poll question, or repeat of the poll question, but I'm not going to do that because we are out of time, and I think it was such an overwhelming acknowledgement at the beginning that demographic changes are going to have an impact on superannuation funds' ability to deliver future investment returns for their members. So can I just ask you all to provide feedback on today's session via the Cmsf app to let you know that our speakers will receive a gift in the form of a donation on their behalf to the First Nations Foundation. Plenary 4 will now take place in Great Hall 1 and 2, doors 6 and 8 at the mezzanine level, and I'd like you to join with me in thanking our panel members, Raf Choudhury and Brnic van Wyk.